Erev Tov, good evening. We are back in our Expanding Horizons shiur. We are going to be discussing the final segment of our section on Sanhedrin, the story of the Sanhedrin, the attempts to revive a Sanhedrin. I promised you today that we would discuss the last modern attempts to revive a Sanhedrin. I told you that there have been many attempts throughout history and I cannot cover all of them, but this one is one that speaks to my heart because not only is it current, but it comes from a Chacham who is a Chacham that is very dear to my heart. And as this shiur is intended in general to expose us to different Chachamim that have created this vision behind Shiviti, I feel that I'm a little bit emotional introducing you to this special rabbi who I don't know that I've formally done it, at least not outside of my San Diego community. Has anyone here ever heard of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Fishman HaKohen Maimon? HaKohen Fishman Maimon, whatever order. Have you heard of him before? From now, I'm just going to call him Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon. It's just the easier version of his name. Has anyone ever seen his name printed in any books anywhere? Possibly? Anyone own any books from Mossad Harav Kook? Most likely his name is in the front cover of your book. You just never noticed it until now. Worth going to take a look. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, though he has a Sephardic sounding last name, is actually one of the famous rabbis of Ashkenaz who were from the early participants and founders, pioneers of the Zionist movement as we know it, the political Zionist movement that ultimately established the State of Israel. Those of you who are familiar with my stances on Zionism and the history of Zionism, and that Zionism didn't start when modern secular political Zionists will tell you that Zionism started. Nonetheless, this contribution of Yehuda Leib Maimon to the Zionist movement is tremendous. He was the rabbi who was sitting to the right of, I think it's to the right of, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, when he was declaring the independence of the State of Israel. You've probably seen that video. David Ben-Gurion gets up and I'm announcing al hakamat Medina Yehudit be'Eretz Israel, the establishment of the State of Israel. If you ever hear that recording of David Ben-Gurion announcing the independence of the State of Israel, you will also hear in the background a voice very clearly reciting Baruch Ata Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam Shehechiyanu V'Kiyimanu V'Higianu Lezman Hazeh. That voice is none other than the voice of Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, who we're going to deal with his writings today. Yehuda Leib Maimon was not actually a fishman. From what I understand, one of his ancestors had to borrow somebody else's passport back in Europe. You think Jews just share things? Jews also share passports every once in a while. He shared his passport. My fishman ended up getting stuck to their last name, and their name became Fishman, but his father or grandfather already used to use the name Maimon when he signed his name due to the fact that his mother's side of the family has a claim that they are descendants of the Rambam, Ben Moshe ben Maimon, and because of that, they always refer to themselves Maimon, even though they were most definitely Ashkenazi Jews. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon was born in 1875, essentially in the region that was part of the Russian Empire. He dies in 1962 at the age of 86, and he was in Tel Aviv, Yafo. So he started his life in Russia, ended up in Yafo. That means that he was around for the first 14 years of the State of Israel, which he had worked so hard to establish. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon was so concerned that the narrative surrounding the founding of the State of Israel, more particularly the religious narrative surrounding the founding of the State of Israel, would become forgotten to his children and to the new generation that was being raised in Eretz Israel, that he actually wrote a book. I have a new copy of this book. There's nothing new about the book. They put a nice cover on it, but the printing inside is still the same old print that anybody else has. This book is called Leman Zion Lo Echashe, and for the sake of Zion I will not be silent. And essentially he leaves behind his memoirs regarding Zionism, political Zionism, the activism, the traveling from city to city and state to state and country to country, fundraising for the Zionist movement, ultimately his joy in being alive. He was always bragging that I was there to recite Shehechiyanu when the modern State of Israel was established. For him, that was a source of pride. Yehuda Leib Maimon merits to not only be there when the first Israeli government is formed, but he was part of the first and second Israeli government. And the first time around, he was there as a rabbi. More formally, that position evolved into what we know as the Shaar Hadatot, the minister of religion. As you know, Israel has a very unique relationship with religion. There was some news going on in the last 2 days that you might have picked up on conversions and things like that has been shaking up the Jewish world a little bit. Israel is not really clear if it's a Jewish country, if it's a democratic country, if there is a separation of church and state, if there's no separation of church and state. It does a really bad job at pretending that it falls into either one of those two categories. And Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, he served as the first minister of religion of the state of Israel. It's very important because his sister, actually, her name was Ada Maimon. She served as the representative of the anti-religious Mapai party at the time in the Knesset. So he was the minister of religion. He was pushing this dream of a Sanhedrin, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, to create a religious state of Israel. And his sister was in charge of the exact opposite movement, and both of them sat across from each other in Knesset. It was a very unique relationship. His sister never had children of her own. Out of a feminist ideal, she chose to never get married or to have children, and essentially her legacy died with her. She did leave behind all kinds of writings and things like that. His family was very proficient, very well, not just well spoken, very well written. His daughter Geula Bat Yehuda, I have the biography that she wrote about her father. So it's a big book. She wrote many other books. I have some of her works at home. She's equally poetic to her father. But as I was telling somebody today in the morning, that Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, aside from being a Talmid Chacham that I resonate with deeply, he's a Talmid Chacham who perhaps has the most poetic Hebrew of any other rabbi that I've ever read, maybe even in my life. His writing style is beautiful, it's captivating, he's charismatic. And many of the ideas that he tried to bring awareness to, unfortunately died with him. Perhaps most notable was his desire, his dream, his mission of his life was to reconvene a Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, and that's exactly where this shiur fits in to the last two that we had together. Before I tell you anything more about Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, there's something that he writes in the end of one of his books, perhaps his magnum opus, is this book called Sarei HaMe'ah. There's a newer version out today. Remember, the newer version is just this version with a nicer cover on it. So you can buy this in actually many bookstores. Believe it or not, I don't think anyone knows what it is, but it's a very famous work of 6 volumes, discussing all kinds of Talmidei Chachamim, mostly Ashkenazi Jewish history, minus the 6th volume, which he discusses Rav Uziel and other Chachamim that he had the privilege to work with and under. If you look at the Google Classroom, there should be a photo that I attached of Rabbi Maimon visiting Baghdad together with Rav Uziel as a delegate. There was an attempt to fundraise and bring Jews to Eretz Yisrael in those early years of political Zionism. Primarily, though, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon was a student of a famous rabbi called Rabbi Yechiel Michal Halevi Epstein. Have you heard of him before? Who was the Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein? He wrote a very famous book.
I heard of him, but I don't know the book.
Very good.
He wrote HaShulchan.
Aruch HaShulchan, very good. Aruch HaShulchan. That's why my mom heard of him. Aruch HaShulchan. Aruch HaShulchan is perhaps the most famous Ashkenazi work on the Shulchan Aruch in the last 150 years. It has steep competition with the Mishnah Berurah, and there's its own politics between those two camps of people who study which one on the Shulchan Aruch. The Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, writes in the introduction of one of his books that he himself comes from a Sephardic family, and that Epstein is when his family fled the Spanish Inquisition, they went to North Africa. From North Africa, where they were Ben Venestes, they became Ben Benishti, like in Morocco, that name became that way. And then on their way back into Poland, Ben Benishti became Epstein, and that's essentially how they got their name. But he always considered himself to be from the stock of Sephardim from Spain. There's some fascinating first-hand encounters that Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon shares about his rabbi. His father was a student of another rabbi by the name of the Malbim. Have you heard of the Malbim before? Otherwise known as the Malbim. Yeah, the Malbim is a commentary on the Tanakh. There are different, a beautiful commentary. Has a very interesting and difficult personal life. So that was his father's rabbi. He himself was a student of the Aruch HaShulchan. He once asked his rabbi, a teaching that resonates very well with me. He once asked his rabbi, said, Rabbi, you are this great Aruch HaShulchan. Why do you always insist on living in this little town over here where nobody sees you and nobody knows you? Why don't you go take a job in a big city? They want you as an Abedin, they want you as a chief rabbi. Why do you stay here? He says, as a rabbi, there's always two things that you know. Two things are, people are not going to like you, and you're always going to be broke. He said the two things that you know. People aren't going to like you, you're always going to be broke. He said in a small town, I have a few people who don't like me, and I'm broke. He said in a big town, I have a lot of people who don't like me, and I'll be just as broke. So why should I leave a small town to go to a big town? For which glory, for which purpose? What's the need for that? The Rav Yehuda Leib Maimon Kohen, at the end of his 6-volume work, he writes a letter to his wife. I just want to share that with you because I think it's something special. There's 2 PDFs attached there. One of them says Sarei HaMe'ah, and one says Chidush HaSanhedrin. Click on the PDF that says Sarei HaMe'ah. So it's attached to the Zoom link. Whatever Google Classroom you're in, go look for that Zoom link, and you should see a PDF that says in it Sarei HaMe'ah. So page 1 just tells you Sarei HaMe'ah, Rishumot al Gdolei Israel, memoirs about great giants of the Jewish people. On the next page, he dedicates his book. It's sad to me that it's rare to find rabbis who'll do this anymore. It's not religious anymore to do such a thing. I don't know what that means, but it's what it is. He dedicates his book to his wife. L'ra'ayati Batya, to my wife, Batya. Ra'ayati is more than a wife. It's it's from the term friend. Ezrati b'chaim, my partner in life. Mincha, this book is dedicated to you. It's a gift to you. In the back of the book, and so you're pretty much skipping 300 pages, you'll see it's page 3 of that PDF. Page 3 of that PDF. He wants to give a final letter of acknowledgement, and here he dedicates the entire series to his wife. In those first and second paragraphs, he shares a story about the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov used to rent a home, a little tiny home, from a Jewish person in the city of Mezhbuzh, the founder of Chassidut. And with whatever money he made, giving brachot to people, they would give him tzedakah. From that little bit of money, he always scraped together some money to pay rent, a little bit of money to give his wife that she should take care of the expenses of the home, food, clothes, whatever else needed to be. And then the rest he gave to tzedakah. And the Baal Shem Tov was famous for saying that he had a hard time going to sleep at night when he still had money left over in his house. And his wife used to take every day from the money that he gave her, she would take a little bit off, and take a little bit off, and take a little bit off. And ultimately, she bought the Baal Shem Tov a house. She bought him his own house. Something modest, but that's where he lived. And at the Chanukat HaBayit, when they put up the mezuzot in the house, the Baal Shem Tov said the following words. If you look in the second paragraph on the page, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines up. B'shat Chanukat HaBayit, when they were dedicating the house, Amar HaBaal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov said, HaChacham mikol adam Amar, the wisest of all men, King Shlomo says in Mishlei, Bayit v'hon nachalat avot, u'me'adonai isha maskelet. That a home and a fortune is something you inherit from your forefathers. And from Hashem, you inherit a wise and discerning wife. Meaning, you can't inherit a wife. You can only inherit money. But a wife you don't inherit. That's from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Upirush hakatuv hu kach. And he says the pasuk really means the following. My mom always says this, but at my engagement party she elaborated on this pasuk. My mother gave a derasha on this pasuk. Ima, this is now a different reading of that pasuk. Bait v'hon yicholim la'astig b'tor Yerusha. The Baal Shem Tov said that a home and a fortune, you can receive that through an inheritance. Minachalat avot, from your parents. Aval im hadavar hazeh ba me'et Hashem. V'lo mitzad Yerusha. But what if a person doesn't inherit anything from their parents? Their parents didn't leave them anything. So now it has to come from Hashem. Your home, your money, everything that you need has to come from Hashem. As HaKadosh Baruch Hu mazmin le'ish isha maskelet. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu then blesses a man with a wise wife. Shehi yodat tetzamtzem et tzorcheha, v'hi bona bayit leba'ala. That she ultimately knows how to manage the finances well, and she knows how to build a home for her husband. So in the event that a person doesn't inherit money from their forefathers, he can inherit a home from HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the divine messenger, which is his wife. And then Rabbi Yehuda Maimon shares the following story. It says, Gam ani zechiti, I also married Kirayati, then my wife, Batya bat Rabbi Shlomo, Batya the daughter of Shlomo, Hiskira lo rak leashgiach alai val briuti, she didn't only take care of me and my health, ela azra li gam beisuf hasifrei hagdola sheli. She was helping me, she was my partner in collecting this great library that I have. Rabbi Yehuda Maimon passed away with 40,000 books in his library. What do you think about that number, 40,000 books? I can't even imagine the bookcases you have to have for that. Miyalduti, from my young age, haiti ragil liknot sfarim. I was used to buying books. My father, he's having nightmares hearing this story. Kamuvan, sfarim ke'ele shemechiram lo gavoa. I said I only bought books that they weren't expensive books. Lachar nisui, after I got married, ratziti liknot li shas. I wanted to buy myself a set of Talmud, a shas. אבל מפני גובה המחיר לא יכולתי להביא, on the top of the next page, page 4, את הברכה הזאת לתוך ביתי. But because of the price, the steep price, I wasn't able to bring this blessing into my home. והייתי מוכרח להשתמש במסכתות שולות, and I had to borrow volumes of the Talmud from other people. אבל כפעם בפעם היו עולים בזיכרוני דבריו של רבי יצחק קפנטון בספרו דרכי הגמרא. So sometimes I remember the words of Rabbi Yitzchak Kapanton, if I'm not mistaken, and I hope I'm not pronouncing his name incorrectly, he was the rabbi of Rabbi Yosef Karo, Maran Shulchan Aruch. In his book Dachei Gemara, he says, "Hakore besfarim she'onim, alav hakatuv omer, vayu chayecha tolim lecha mineged." He says it's not a good thing to borrow books from other people. Rather, you should own your own books. I have a very hard time taking books from a library. Just the thought that I'm going to have to give them back in 2 weeks from now, has a disastrous effect on my ability to sit down and read a book calmly and get through the book. Okay, it's a problem. Not everyone has that problem. Pam achad bereshit hachoref, once in the beginning of the winter, huzmanti le'ir Berdichev binanim tzionim. I was invited to the city of Berdichev to take care of some Zionist matters there. Terem nesiati, before I left, amarti toch kedei sicha l'rayati, I told my wife in passing through conversation, ki l'maleh haya li kesef, if only I had the money, hayiti yachol lechosh li beBerdichev shas shalem muhudar, that I could purchase in Berdichev, I guess it was a bigger town, I could buy a beautiful set of shas over there. He shalauti, my wife asked me, kama tzarich lalot shas kaze? How much does a shas cost in Berdichev? והתשובתי שצריך למצער 50 רובל, he said, and I told her that sadly, that I need 50 rubles. 50 rubles must be a huge amount of money. You can imagine a shas today costs a good $1,000 if you want to buy a regular shas, $1,000. So I don't know how much is that in pounds. About 1,500 pounds, could it be? No, less, other way around. Other way around, right? So it's like 750 pounds, could it make sense? משהו כזה? Okay. אמר לי, he said, she told me that she's been saving 50 rubles. She said, I was waiting to buy myself a fur coat for the winter, but I have 50 rubles. Take this money and go buy yourself a Talmud. But the beauty of this story, unlike those Hasidic stories you hear where the family's dying of hunger and nobody has any food and nobody has any drink and the husband goes and buys an etrog for $1 million and the whole family dies of hunger. You know those stories? Every Sukkot they hear these stories about people wasting all of their family's money to buy something that you don't have to have even if you don't have money for. Here, she's giving him the money. She wants him to spend the money for this. Said, and I was able to buy not just the Babylonian Talmud, but also Yerushalmi Talmud, Dfus Jitomer. This is a special printing of the Talmud for a different conversation. Otek Yafeh Meod, a beautiful copy. And that book, that set of books is still in my library. Az amarti b'libi, and then I said in my heart, Eshet chayil mimtza v'rachok mipnim micha. Who will find a woman of valor? Batach ba'alev bala. Her husband's heart trusts her. V'shalal lo yichsar. And he won't be lacking shalal. Shalal, he says, is in gematria shas. A man who has a wife like his will not be lacking a shas in his home. And from that moment on, I began growing my library. Even though I lived in a rental apartment and I didn't have any money, he said, but I still kept growing my library in this little place. And the books were stacks on top of stacks of books all around my house. He said, and once when I had to leave Eretz Israel to go on behalf of the Mizrahi organization to fundraise in America. התמהמהתי שם כחצי שנה, I was stuck there for about half a year. וכשחזרתי לביתי בארץ ישראל, and when I came home to Israel, מצאתי בית בנו לתלפיות. I found a beautiful home. וגם ארונות מתאימים היו מוכנים כבר בשביל הספרים, and there were custom-made bookcases for my books. נזכרתי אז בדברי בעל שם טוב, and then I remember the words of the בעל שם טוב, והריני מברכת רעייתי, and therefore I bless my wife who bought me this home while I was gone in America, and who put bookcases for my books. I bless her, שתאריך ימים ושנים, she shall live a long and healthy life, ותוסיף עוצמה וכוח להשגיח על ספרייתי זאת. And may she continue to be given strength to safeguard my library, שהיא נשמת נשמתי, which is the soul of my soul. And for me, these words remind me a lot of our Rabbanit. It's okay to embarrass her in public. To tell you the truth is, Baruch Hashem, people not liking us, now I'm in a group of people who like us. But, finding money to buy books is a difficult thing. The Rabbanit always tells me the following things. She says, listen, if you go buy food, you go buy, So it lasts for a few hours, then, I won't mention here what happens, but the food disappears afterward. But if you buy Sifrei Kodesh, you buy books and you have them on your shelf, so the set of Rambam that you buy, it's not going anywhere. It's there. It's going to be there forever. And Baruch Hashem, my home, I don't have 40,000 books, but it's a goal to reach one day, B'ezrat Hashem. But my library is also Nishmat Nishmati. I'm lucky, I think I'm even luckier than Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, is that my library is not just my library, it's my wife's library also. My wife has her own bookcases on top of bookcases on top of bookcases. She has her own stack of books that don't fit on bookcases. And B'ezrat Hashem Yitbarach, I think that this relationship here between Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon and his wife Batya is something unique, it's something special. And it's something that in a world that we live in today where everything people talk about is how husbands and wives don't get along with each other, everything is just a glorified roommate, they're just suffering to be married, all kinds of things like that. Okay, we tell jokes, but really it's not true. Really there are people in the world who find people that they really love and they're really close to. And I always tell people, for those of you who are still looking, don't settle for less. Don't settle for a person who wouldn't give up their fur coat to buy you a library. And don't buy a library with somebody else's money to get a fur coat. But there is a world in where beautiful relationships exist. And our Chachamim, contrary to what you might see in the streets, our Chachamim had beautiful relationships with their spouses. That being said, this was an absolute detour. It has nothing to do with the Sanhedrin, but everything to do with setting up an image for you of who was Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon. And being that I read that piece, we're going to have to run through just a few selected paragraphs from the 17-page PDF that I sent your way. So if you just open up the PDF to the Sanhedrin PDF there, I think it's called Chidush HaSanhedrin, I titled it. It should be also attached to the Zoom invitation. Now this is 17 pages from a book. This book is so dear to me that I own two different printings of it, two different copies of it. You can't find it really anywhere today unless you're looking for a used copy. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon spent his life not just trying to found a state of Israel, which he ultimately was successful. This Zionist ideal, this dream that he had signed up for, ultimately bore fruit, and he was there. Imagine all those years, those people who tried to found the state of Israel, and they didn't make it to see that day. I think a lot about Rav Kook. Rav Kook's dream was to see an independent state of Israel in the Jewish homeland, but he never merited to see it. He passed away in the 30s and never saw it. Rav Uziel, who spent his life fighting for such an ideal, he dies in 1953. He spends almost barely 5 years in the modern state of Israel. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon merited to spend 14 years of the end of his life in an independent Jewish homeland. But that wasn't enough for him. It wasn't enough. For him, his dream was to reconvene a Sanhedrin. It's not enough to just build a country. A new country, a new Jewish homeland, a new Jewish state of Israel needs a new Jewish vision for its religious future. And in order for that to happen, there has to be a Sanhedrin. You cannot rejuvenate a religion without its national Supreme Court, without its Sanhedrin that would be able to make those decisions on behalf of the whole Jewish people. And he spent his life, already from the early 1900s, maybe even already 1910, 1911, you hear him talking about the Sanhedrin. And then, until the day he dies, and this idea of the Sanhedrin, unfortunately, seems to have died with him. His plans for a Sanhedrin, though gained a little bit of momentum and a little bit of traction, was met with such bitter opposition. And if not opposition, then just apathy. Apathy by the rabbinic establishment, disbelief by the lay people. Who needs a Sanhedrin? What do we need a Sanhedrin for? And Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon takes this vision with him to the grave, and I feel that today we might do him just a little bit of justice by keeping this vision alive here with us in this Bet Midrash. I have here a telegram that I printed last night. This telegram was sent in 1958, so around May of 1958. And this is 10 years after the founding of the State of Israel. This telegram was sent by the Union of Orthodox Rabbis in America, Rabbi Eliezer Silver, Rabbi Pinchas Teitz, Rabbi Meir Cohen. This is a letter essentially requesting that Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon be excommunicated for his blasphemous suggestions, most notably for his speech towards the Brisker Rav, the Griz as he was called. The Brisker Rav was perhaps Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon's greatest opponent to this idea of a Sanhedrin. He was a notorious anti-Zionist in general regarding the modern state of Israel, but he could not fathom the thought that there was even somebody who was trying to found a Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, and he spent his life fighting Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon on this idea. Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon must have said something to the effect of something that wasn't so kind towards the Brisker Rav, and these American rabbis decided to get involved and to send a telegram to Israel saying that he needs to do teshuvah, and if not, that all these terrible halachot and the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch would apply to the Leib Maimon for blaspheming the holy Brisker Rav. Let's open up the PDF here. So the title of the book is Chidush HaSanhedrin, the re-establishment of a Sanhedrin b'mdinatenu hamechudeshet, in our newly re-established state of Israel. And if you look on page 2 of the PDF, I want to read to you this page. Choveret zo, this booklet, nitpesa behemshechim. I scanned these pages for you, so this is not a complete PDF file. These are just the scans of some pages I want you to see. This booklet was printed in installments. Parakim b'Sinai u'b'Atzofeh. They were printed in different periodicals. ועכשיו כשבאתי להוציא את כל הפרקים הללו בחוברת מיוחדת, לא רציתי לשנות אף כקוצרו של יום מה שכתבתי בעניין זה במשך שנה וחצי. I said, even though it was taking me a year and a half to publish these articles, I didn't want to change any of them now that they are being published together in a book. Why? לא לגרוע וגם לא להוסיף. I don't want to add, I don't want to take away. יקרא נא הקורא את דבריי. I wish for the reader to read my words כפי שיצאו מאיתי בכתיבה ראשונה מתוך הרגשת לב פנימית והשראה מיוחדת. I want them to feel the passion that was through my pen, the emotion in which I wrote these words. I don't want to reformat them as a book. I want you to read them as the emotional words that I've written. And then he says in the end of that paragraph, I also chose not to get involved in any halachic debates. He said, I intended with this booklet more to penetrate the heart than to penetrate the mind. With hope, that just as these words left the depths of my heart, that they also will enter the depths of the heart of my readers. And regardless of what you feel about reconvening a Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, I think it's very hard to not get moved by the emotion with which Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon writes about this topic. He discusses here the Mahari Berav, Rabbi, which we spoke about 2 weeks ago, in his dream of founding a Sanhedrin in Tzfat. Let's look at the last 3 sentences in that paragraph. The last 3 lines of the second paragraph on page 2. Unfortunately, the dreams of that generation of Mahari Berav and Maran Rabbi Yosef Karo in Tzfat did not come to fruition. But if we the people who have merited to see the new state of Israel being born in its homeland, if they who tried so hard without a state of Israel to found the Sanhedrin, how much more so we who have a state of Israel are obligated to attempt to reconvene a Sanhedrin. Chachmenu Amru, our rabbis tell us in Masechet Bava Batra, ראויה הייתה פרשת נחלות להיכתב על ידי משה. That the laws of inheritances were supposed to be, they were merited, they should have been written down by Moshe. אלה שזכו בנות צלופחד ונכתבה על ידן. But the daughters of Tzlofchad, who are the daughters of Tzlofchad? Someone tell me the story. Who are the daughters of Tzlofchad?
they fought to inherit their father's fortune. He didn't have a son, and they thought that they should inherit.
And essentially they go to Moshe, and Moshe says, I'm going to ask the Creator. He gets back and says, yes, they should. So we learn from their halachot regarding inheritance of daughters from their father. Our rabbis tell us in the Talmud that it should have been Moshe who should have taught us those halachot. But Moshe didn't merit, rather the daughters of Tzlofchad merited to teach these halachot to the Jewish people. It was a special zechut. He says, so I also think that I'm deserving to say, that even if the previous generation was not successful in reconvening a Sanhedrin, I believe that our generation, like the daughters of Tzlofchad, should be able to have the merit to reconvene a Sanhedrin. But if they don't know, if they don't merit, says, but I know for certain that if the great rabbis of our generation are too small-minded, and they are unable, they don't have in them the ability to do what's right, to rise up to the occasion and reconvene a Sanhedrin, as barur li, it is clear to me, שהסנהדרין תתחדש על ידי עזת צלופחדים, that the Sanhedrin will not be established by Moshe Rabbeinu, not by the greats of this generation, but by some small daughters of Tzlofchad. מה דמות ופנים, ומי יודע מה דמות ופנים תהיינה אז למוסד התורני העליון מוקדש זה. רבים מן הרבנים, says many of the rabbis, מורגל בפיהם לומר, they have this phrase in their mouth. Whenever you ask them a Sanhedrin, they always say, כי לא, עדיין לא הוכשר הדור. The generation is not yet ready. The generation is not yet deserving for a Sanhedrin. ורבים מבני הדור חוזרים ואומרים, and most of the people of the generation, when they're asked about a Sanhedrin, they're used to retorting, כי עדיין לא הוכשרו הרבנים, that our rabbis are not great enough yet to sit in a Sanhedrin. So the rabbis blame the people blame the rabbis, everybody's blaming each other, that the other one is the reason why there is no Sanhedrin. אבל כאלה כן אלה טועים הם, said, but I think that both of them are wrong. אם זכה הדור זה לקומם מחדש מדינת ישראל, if the Creator gave us the ability in this generation to found the state of Israel, מוכשר הוא ורבניו גם לחדש את מוסד התורה העליון. So of course that it means that the rabbis of this generation and the people of this generation, both of them, will merit to found the Sanhedrin.
No.
And he writes,
Wait for somebody to shut up.
אשרי מי שיזכה להניח את יסוד הסנהדרין המחודש בימינו, and how praiseworthy is the individual who will be able to lay the cornerstone of the new Sanhedrin in our generation. Essentially, here Rebbe Dalet Memon is sharing with you his dream. His dream is, you tell me, and he writes this in so many words throughout his book. I said, I remember the people who told me that I was crazy when I was sitting in Berdichev and I was telling them, we're going to found the state of Israel. We're going to have a Jewish army one day. We're going to have a Jewish police force. And I remember they told me I was a lunatic. They used to send me out of the Batei Knesset. They told me this guy has lost his mind. He said, I remember the rabbis who made fun of me. I remember the donors who threw me out of their living rooms. He said, but guess what? Who's laughing now? He said, I'm here. We have a state of Israel. We have a Jewish army. We have a police force. And I'm not crazy. He says, so now I'm telling you that the next step is to have a Sanhedrin. So the same people are telling me that I'm crazy. And the same people tell me I'm losing my mind. The same people are telling me it's not the reality, it can never happen, it's not true. He said, but I'm telling you that I know that it will happen. It just matters who will happen. If the rabbis can't do it and the people won't do it, so some small people will do it. And they will lay the cornerstone of the new Sanhedrin. On page 3 of the PDF, he writes the following. And but I remember, if you need to interrupt me at any point, please do. I just want to cover as much ground as I can before we have to end this shiur today. Yodan, he says, I know, כי נושא מאמרי זה על חידוש הסנהדרין במדתנו המחודשת, that I know that the topic of this article of reconvening a Sanhedrin in our new state of Israel, יעורר עליי קטגוריה מצדדים שונים. I'll be the object of ridicule from different directions. לא נהנה ממני. It's not that I don't know that. כי הצעתי לחדש את הסנהדרין במדינת ישראל תהיה בעיני רבים כדמיון רחוק. He says, I know that most people who hear this idea of reconvening a Sanhedrin will think it's some faraway fantasy. כחלום מטושטש, like a blurry dream. וכי גם מסתרה דימינה וגם מסתרה דשמאלה This is Kabbalistic language that he's borrowing. Ribudale Maimon, though he comes from a Lithuanian, not Lithuanian, but a non-Hasidic Ashkenazi family, he spent much time in the shade of many Hasidic rabbis and Hasidic communities, and he always connected very much that ideology into a certain. You'll always hear slight Kabbalistic references that he picked up on in the years that he spent there. He said, whether it's from the right side or the left side of the political spectrum, they won't only think about this reluctantly, I know that they're even going to suspect me. They're going to be suspicious of why I'm talking so much about the Sanhedrin. The first camp, the religious right-wing camp, that's what he's calling them. He says they'll look at me because anything that's new, the religious people can't handle. Any new conversation, anything that's progressive, anything that's groundbreaking, the religious community doesn't know how to deal with it. V'acharonim, and the other side of the community, they're going to mock me and suspect me because I'm trying to revive something that's old. And they don't like anything that comes from the past. They only want things that are new. וכאלה כן אלה יבואו עליי בטענות וטריונות וגם בהתנגדות גמורה. I said, and they'll not just mock me and ridicule me, but they'll actually oppose me. או באופן הטוב ביותר, or at the very least, if they don't oppose me, יתייחסו לגמרי בביטול לדבר, ובבבם יחשבו גם בפיהם יאמרו, הנה בעל החלומות הלזה בא. He says, if they won't take me seriously enough to oppose me, at the very least, they'll dismiss me like, oh look, this dreamer is coming. Who said that pasuk? Who said that? Oh, the dreamer is coming. Where's that pasuk found?
The brothers about Yosef.
Very good, Itai. The brothers about Yosef. When Yosef has these dreams, oh look, Bala Chalamot this dreamer is coming. So at the very least, they'll mock me as just a person who has fantasies. בפסוק מפורש זה בוודאי יפגשוני רבים מן הקוראים. He said, and I'm certain that even some of you readers who are reading these words, you're going to treat me like I'm a dreamer as well. וצריך אני להודות, and I must admit, כי מיום עומדי על דעתי, from the day that I had an intellect in my mind, ומיום אשר צמחו כנפיים לדמיוני, and from the day in which my imagination sprouted its wings, חלום חלמתי על תחייתה של הסנהדרין. I have been dreaming since that day about the reconvening of a Sanhedrin. כשם שחלמתי על התחדשותה של מדינת ישראל, the same way that I dreamed about reconvening a state of Israel in the land of Israel. ושר החלומות והחזיונות לוחש באוזני גם עכשיו. And that dream angel, the angel of dreams, is still whispering in my ear just like he did then. כשם שהתגשם חלומך על המדינה העברית, just like your dream regarding the Jewish state has come true. שאותה זכית לראות בעיניך, that you merited to see with your own eyes, כן יבוא יום, there will come a day. וחלומך על התחדשות הסנהדרין יקום, ויהיה למציאות של ממש. And also your dream of a Sanhedrin will once again come true. That angel of dreams whispers in my ear. He mentions in the next paragraph that as the Jewish people move forward, things change. People's stances on things change. People's attitudes change. Society shifts. The way people look at things shifts. And if you remember Rav Uziel who said that as the world changes, halakha has to reassess and reanalyze everything that's happening in the world. Says Rabbi Yehuda Maimon at the end of this next paragraph, knowing that all of these shifts are taking place in the world, כי יחד עם התחדשות המדינה העברית, that with this rebirth of a Jewish state of Israel, צריכים מחויבים אנחנו לעשות מעשים ופעולות ממשיות כדי לחדש גם את הסנהדריה העברית שלנו. That in order to deal with these issues, we have no choice but to reconvene our own Sanhedrin again in the land of Israel. Then he writes the following. אבל קודם שאני בא לבאר ולברר את צדקת מחשבתי זאת מתוך ההשקפה התורנית ומתוך המהלך ההיסטורי של החיים העצמיים שלנו. So before I'm going to write the rest of this book to explain to you the theological and halakhic ramifications. How can you reconvene a Sanhedrin? Why should we do it? מוצא אני לי לחובה להגיד בדברים ברורים. I feel an obligation to share with you in clear words. את אשר אני, that I, כאחד החולמים והלוחמים על יסוד מדינת probably Israel, חושב על טיבה ומהותה ואיכותה של מדינתנו המחודשת. He said, I, who was one of the dreamers and then later the warriors, who gained independence for this state of Israel, this is what I feel about the state of Israel that I founded. מדינת ישראל, the state of Israel, צריכה להיות יונקת את החיים הרוחניים שלה, must nurture its spiritual life, מתוך מקור ישראל, from the source of Israel. מדינת ישראל בלי תורת ישראל, a state of Israel without a Torah of Israel, בלי משפט התורה שלנו, without our Jewish laws, לא תהיה מה שהיא צריכה להיות, will never become what it should become. בלי פתיחת מעיינות התורה, without opening the well springs of the Torah, בלי הפרחת המשפט, on page 4, העברי המקורי, without opening up the well springs of the original Hebrew laws, בלי הרחבתה ותחייתה של ספרותינו העתיקה, without the revival and the rejuvenation of our Jewish literature, books of rabbinic literature, לכל עומק הוראותיו ומובניו של מושג גדול זה, אין לקיים את מדינתנו בתור מדינת ישראל. It would be impossible to consider our country a Jewish state of Israel if it does not accomplish these things. I'll skip the next paragraph. בשביל התחדשות הסנהדרין שלנו, and in order to reconvene our Sanhedrin, אין אנו צריכים לחסדי מלכים ושרים. We don't need the compassion or the gifts of any kingdom or any officers. להסכמת העצרת של האומות המאוחדות. We don't need a UN resolution. להכרזות דו-פרצופיות של ממשלות. We don't need any hypocritical governments to stamp their approval on our dream of a Sanhedrin. שאינן מקרבות אומות חלשות ומנהגיהן אלא להנאתן ומרחיקות ודוחות אותן מעליהן בשעה שאין להן צורך מיוחד בהן. I never speak politics, but here Rabbi Yehuda Maimon is telling you this is not politics. This is the truth. He said every time a strong country does good things to a weak country like the state of Israel, they only do it for their own interests. And the moment they don't need you anymore, they push you away. And for anybody who thinks at any moment in time that anybody helps the state of Israel because they truly love them and not for some ulterior motive, they're mistaken. אין אנו צריכים לזנות אחר הדיפלומטיה המסוכסכת. We don't have to stray after, and there's a harsh word for stray, stray after any politics וגינוניה המשתנים מוחלפים לרוח היום והשעה, the ever-changing political policies. אין אנו צריכים גם לאבד כוחותינו זמננו בתגרות וסכסוכים וגם לא במלחמות עם הערבים ומסיתיהם. He says that we don't even have to fight anybody. We don't even have to go up against the Arabs or those who incite the Arabs. That we won't have to get involved in anything political to found the Sanhedrin. אין אנו זקוקים בה גם להתייפות ולמצוא בני ראשי האמונות השונות. So we also have no need to look good in front of the eyes of the other religions of the world. להפך, to the contrary. ברור הדבר, it's clear, כי הסנהדריה שלנו תהיה לבת סמך החשובה ביותר בעיני כל כהני הדתות שבעולם. He said that all the nations of the world, especially the religious ones, will see in the reconvening of a Sanhedrin something powerful. כבודנו יגדל, our honor will only grow. ואמונה בנו ומדינתנו תתגדל ותתחזק. And the belief, the trust, the faith in our state of Israel will only grow and become stronger. משום כך, it's for these reasons, says Rabbi Yehuda Maimon. מרגיש אני, I feel, כי אינני רשאי לכבוש בקרבי מחשבתי זו, that I can no longer suppress this feeling inside of me. ואין אני בן חורין להשאירה צפונה בליבי, and I'm no longer given the freedom to hide this conversation about the Sanhedrin from you. רק למען לעשות נחת רוח לכל מיני נכשלים ופקפקנים. The only thing that I will do if I'm silent is to make all of these naysayers happy. אשר אימת החדש או הפחד מפני כל דבר ישן מכים בהם את חוש העתיד. He said that these people are either afraid of the new or they're afraid of the old. Either way, they're afraid. He said, I don't want to have to deal with it. Rather, it's time for me to share with you my vision for a Sanhedrin in the state of Israel. I think we should skip many pages. Give me a second. If you look on page 7 in your PDF, at the bottom of the page, Rabbi Maimon is writing, he says, this entry that I'm writing into my book, it says that this opposition became so harsh and so stiff that I just couldn't continue writing about the Sanhedrin with a clear mind while I was still in the presence of people. said, I feel like I'm going to have to leave. I'm going to have to go somewhere else in order to think clearly and not be persecuted for the things that I'm thinking and I feel that I need to share. If you look on page 9, his next entry into his book says, Yoshev ani b'chadri. I'm sitting in my room, the bottom of page 9. I'm sitting in my room. בפינתי החבויה אשר לאחד ההרים של ארצנו היקרה. In a hidden corner of one of the mountaintops of our precious country. נהנה מבדידותי. I'm enjoying my loneliness. מהדממה השוררת בחדר, from the silence that is taking over this room. ומן החלון נשקפים לי מחזות הטבע הנפלאים המתגלים בארץ עברים זאת. And through my window I'm looking out at this hilltops of Judea, and I'm seeing the wonders of nature that are a part of our holy country. מחזות שהכשירו העוד משנים קדמוניות כמטרופולין לדעות רמות ונשגבות ולמרכז הנבואה והחזון. These same mountaintops which gave inspiration to the prophets to create a place in the land of Israel where people could share thoughts and ideas and philosophies. לבירת האגדה ולפינת תקרת המסתורין, הקבלה והחסידות. Ultimately this continued to be the headquarters of Kabbalah, of Chassidut, of all kinds of spiritual movements. And the top of the next page, page 10. U'mesavivli, and surrounding me, Demama, there's silence. Demamat Eretz Yisrael hanifla'a, the silence of the wondrous land of Israel. המחכה עדיין לגאון הזמרה שיבוא ויגלה את סוד שירתה הגדולה והרזית. The silent land of Israel that is still waiting for someone to uncover from her depths her hidden inner song. And then he began again talking about the Sanhedrin and how he remembers when that first book of Theodor Herzl came to his life and he heard about this idea of a state of Israel and he knew that it would never be complete without a Sanhedrin. And he continues writing more and more in this vein. On page 12 of the PDF, this is already the 6th chapter, Yehuda Leib Maimon is feeling doubt. After great ideas, you should know what happens to everybody, even here. When I give a shiur, my wife will tell you one of the first calls, my wife calls me right after my class to give me critique on the shiur. Was it a good shiur? Was it a bad shiur? Was it a boring shiur? Did I speak too much about this? And it's always the feedback. I've been teaching for years. I teach sometimes 3 or 4 classes in a day. But still, at the end of a shiur, when one of you send me a message, Rabbi, that was a nice shiur, or I didn't like something, or just the fact that someone is listening makes the shiur being worth it. When you just record something, and who knows if someone's going to listen to it, who knows who's going to read it. You write an article, you write an entry in a journal, you'll never know if someone is going to see it. There's a sipuk, there's a certain spiritual satisfaction that comes to a person when you know that the words that mean so much to you are being heard by somebody else. In this case, it's a chesed you do for me. And here, Yehuda Maimon is worried. Odeh v'lo evosh. I'm not embarrassed to admit. מיום שהתחלתי לכתוב ולהדפיס את מאמרי על חידוש הסנהדרין בדנו המחודשת, when I started writing this book, מנקרים במוחי ובבי ספקות ופקפוקים, there are all kind of doubts that are pecking away at my mind. למי אני כותב ומדפיס? Who am I writing this book to? בעד מי ובשביל מי? On behalf of who and for who? הלא יודע אני, I already know, כי המילה הנתפסת כמו המילה החיה, אבדה את ערכה, איבדה את ערכה. I know that the written word, just like the living word, in our generation, has lost its value. את משקלה ואת כוח השפעתה על הגורמים ועל השומעים. I know that written word doesn't mean what it used to mean. Today everybody writes. Today everybody publishes. Today you read so much text just by swiping through something on your phone. He didn't even know those things. That written word doesn't mean anything anymore. Who am I writing this for? Who even cares to listen? This paragraph is a very telling paragraph. For those of you who are writers, this is a very heart-wrenching paragraph just on, is it even worth writing anymore? People print newspapers and they just throw them in the trash the next day. People wrote articles, people wrote essays, people wrote opinion pieces, and then they just go to the trash and no one reads them ever again. He questions whether the written word today has any value. He's feeling doubt. But then he says here that he's writing this chapter. Look at the last sentence of the long paragraph. But this chapter I'm writing with satisfaction. Why? Because this week a rabbi wrote me a letter saying that he read my article. He said, and this one rabbi who wrote me a letter saying he read my article, he gave life back to me. This idea of a Sanhedrin. He goes on to deal with the rabbi's letter. But you hear a person who's here, he founded a state of Israel, he has a vision, where should Israel go from here? And there's only crickets chirping. There's nobody listening anymore. Nobody cares anymore. And he's feeling the hurt, he's feeling the pain. And perhaps the last long paragraph I'll read for you is on page 14 of your PDF. In the 9th chapter. Here he writes about the damage that he suffered from talking too much about this idea of a Sanhedrin. In the middle of the page, הראותי את מעשיי וקפחתי את השפעתי. I have done terrible things, and I have lost out on my influence over the Jewish people. בשנים האחרונות, in the last few years, ובייחוד מיום שהוכרזה המדינה העברית, ואני זכיתי להשתתף בממשלת ישראל. He said, in the last few years, and especially since I merited to be a member of the first Israeli government, עלה כוכבי, my star rose, ונתגברה השפעתי בתוך היהדות הדתית, and I became a person of influence in the religious community. ואולם חטא חטאתי. But I sinned a terrible sin. I made the mistake. התחלתי לדבר בכתב ובעל פה על חידוש הסנהדרין. I began to write and to speak about this matter of a Sanhedrin. כתבתי כמה פרקים בנושא הזה. I wrote a few chapters about this topic. נאמתי איזו נאומים בתוך חוגים מצומצמים של היהדות החרדית. I spoke in some of the more religious elements of the Jewish community about this dream of convening a Sanhedrin. ונדמה היה לי כי הצלחתי להלהיב מעט את הלבבות, and I thought that I had managed to inspire people to this vision, to this idea. אבל בזמן האחרון, but lately, התחלתי להרגיש, I began to feel, כי הצעתי זאת בדבר חידושה של הסנהדרין, מחלישה ומתישה את כוח השפעתי בתוך היהדות הדתית. He said, but I feel that maybe I was wrong, and that my desire to speak about this, my writing about this, has caused for me to lose my influence in the religious community, ובייחוד בקרב הרבנים, and most specifically, the rabbis have stopped listening to anything that I have to say. Uvdahi, it's a fact. Uvda ma'atziva, and it's a sad fact. But I think that any of us in our lives, we make choices. And sometimes those choices are good choices. But we know that by dealing with a certain topic, we're going to become an easy target for somebody else. And sometimes it's not a mistake. I'm not talking here about mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. I'm talking about a choice. It's a career move. I left this company to go work for a startup. And what happened? That startup went out of business, and then my original company doesn't want me back. And now I'm left without a parnasa. This happens all the time. Sometimes we choose to speak up about an issue. And then we realize very quickly the issue that we chose to speak up about, it's not politically correct. The world doesn't want to hear it yet. How many of those who fought for civil rights back in the day lost everything they had for the things they chose to speak up about? So maybe today it's easy. Today everybody wants to be like that, but then it wasn't. Then they were like Avraham Avinu standing up against the whole world. Sometimes we make choices. By the way, you should know, now it's Pesach time. Everybody goes to this Shiviti Pesach forum and they post foods and barbecue chips. Are they good for Pesach? If I would give a class now on Facebook, how many people want to learn with me about my dream of a Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim? We're going to have exactly 17 people like we have right now, minus 2 because 2 of them are me on the screen, so 15 people. But if I'm going to give a class now, are Cheetos kosher for Pesach? You can imagine you might pull in 1,000 people for that shiur. It's something with the Jewish people. By the way, it happens this way. I knew, for example, that when I opened up my bedin for Giyuv, I knew that when I opened up my bedin, I would become an easy target for people. It's very easy, once you start getting involved in certain areas of Judaism, to just write you off completely. You have to make choices. I don't regret any choices that I made, but you have to make choices with a lot of foresight and to be able to think forward. Is this going to harm me? Is this a parade I have to dance at? I was approached a number of years ago by an organization in Israel that does independent weddings, and they wanted somebody who would be willing to take upon themselves the responsibility of the halachic side of this organization. I said no. Why no? Very simple. I can't dance at every parade. I can't be at every festival. I have to know what in life I came to do and what I didn't come to do. And Baruch Hashem, there's good people doing that work. I don't have to be part of that. Rabbi Leib Maimon feels the same thing here. It's a sad fact. People like public figures. Authors. Sometimes they even like politicians. So long as they stick to the agenda, they stick to the company line of protecting the benefits of the people who they were appointed to take care of. So long as they're intent to stick to whatever has been said before, and they don't try to do what Avraham Avinu did. The Midrash says that if the world took a stance on one thing, Avraham Avinu was always on the other side. Ivri, Hebrew. Ivri also means a contrarian. Avraham Avinu was a contrarian. But if you ever worry like why you don't fit in somewhere, why you're not mainstream enough, why you're not, it's because you're a child of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu was defined, not a rabbi, not a tzaddik, Avraham ha-Ivri, Avraham the contrarian. That's who we are. That's part of being a Jewish person, is to be a contrarian. They will love you so long as you talk to them about whatever they want to hear. But if a dignified person, it doesn't make a difference who they are, will go out to the nation, and they'll attempt to broach a new subject, to talk about something that you shouldn't be talking about, that the other honoraries still don't like to hear about. At that moment, a person can lose everything they ever built in their life because they chose to talk about something they should not have spoken about. It says, and that's my sin. That I published my book about the Sanhedrin without asking for the permission of the other rabbis who didn't want me to talk about it. That according to them, I was supposed to come and ask them permission to speak about this. And to receive their approval. And this whole chapter talks about the persecution he felt for the hands of people who didn't want him to talk about this. And that maybe he is an ideologist, maybe he is an idealist, maybe there's an ideal here. But this ideal is one that is worth fighting for. And just because it sounds fantastical doesn't mean it can never happen. I want to leave you off just with the last page of his book. If you look at the PDF on page 16. We mentioned 2 weeks ago that in order to rebuild the Bet Midrash, you need a Sanhedrin, to have Mashiach, you need a Sanhedrin. He mentions that if you look in the Shulchan Aruch says that children, even if it comes to build the Bet Midrash, they don't stop learning Torah. Do you remember this halakha? We don't stop children from learning Torah, even if they ask them to come build the Bet Midrash. Now here's an interesting question. We know the Shulchan Aruch doesn't talk about anything that happens in the days of Mashiach. Shulchan Aruch only talks about things that happen while the Jews are in exile mode. And he uses that piece to show that this building of the Bet Mikdash, which has to be preceded by the founding of a Sanhedrin, is something that exists before the Mashiach, before anything else, that we have the obligation to put those things in order. Nonetheless, he writes here at the bottom of page 16 in your PDF. Ach bechat shagu chachmei Tzfat. Says there was one mistake that our rabbis of Tzfat made. ברצותם לעשות את עירם למרכז עולמה של היהדות, ושכחו כי רק מרכז קדוש אחד לנו ירושלים, רק היא ואין עוד מלבדם. He said that they maybe made a mistake, and the mistake was that they chose to replace Jerusalem with Tzfat. And maybe had they been a little more savvy and realized that let's go to Jerusalem, let's make a Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, it could be that idea would have happened. לדאבוננו, unfortunately, לא הייתה אז השעה מוכשרת. For whatever reason, that generation was not ready for a Sanhedrin. חלומו של דון יוסף הנשיא, the dream of Don Yosef. Who's Don Yosef? You guys know Don Yosef? You guys familiar with Dona Gracia? Yeah. This family, Dona Gracia, if you were going to ask me who is the founder of the modern state of Israel, I will tell you Dona Gracia. Who was the first man who had the dream of the state of Israel? First of all, it wasn't a man, and it wasn't Theodore Herzl. It was Dona Gracia. It was a woman, a righteous woman, perhaps one of the most influential Jewish women in our history. One of my heroes. So this is Don Yosef Anasi. Lo nidgashem, those dreams didn't come to fruition. On page 17 of the PDF, Shlomo Molcho, remember we spoke about Rabbi Shlomo Molcho? Nisraf al Kedushat Hashem, he was burned alive. V'mari berav, and Mari berav, haya muchach livrach mitzvat. He was forced to run away from Tzvat. V'chol ha'machshavot al chidush Sanhedrin lo yecholot litkayem. And none of those dreams of a Sanhedrin ever came true. Lo mipnei shezeh neged halacha, not because those ideas were against halacha. Rather, why did they fail? Ele mishum shezeh haya neged hamatzav b'mimehem. Because it was against what people were feeling in those days. But now, אשרינו שזכינו לראות בחידוש מדינתנו ותקומת ירושלים בירתנו הנצחית. We have merited to see the revival of the state of Israel and the capital restored to Jerusalem. והדברור לפני, כי לו זכו וחייב אתנו אותם גדולנו, מאורות ישראל, היו הם מחדשים את השמיכה ומקימים את הסנהדרין, בלא פקפוק והיסוס. Our rabbis, they have in their hands the power to reconvene a Sanhedrin and to restore Semicha. והרי גם הרלב"ח כותב בהשגותיו על קונטרס הסמיכה שמלכתחילה לא היה מתנגד עצם הרעיון, לולא מהרו חכמי צבת ועשו על דעת עצמם. Even the Maharalbach, Rabbi Levi ben Chabib, the opponent of Mari Berav we spoke about 2 weeks ago, even he wasn't in theory opposed to a Sanhedrin. He was opposed to the way in which it came about. Et לעשות Adonai. It's a time to do for God. הגיעה השעה הגדולה. The great time has come. V'chova al gedolenu, and it's an obligation on the leaders of our people. Rabbanei Eretz Yisrael, the rabbis of the land of Israel, lihitromem, to arise, ulachush et meshach kanfei Shechina, and to feel the wings of the Shekhinah. Et hatzav hakore lehem, liratem b'meretz la'avodat hachana likat chidush haSanhedrin, to hear the divine voice that is calling out to them, that now is the time to reconvene the Sanhedrin. אם נדע לכוון את הרגע ולא להחמיצנו בהיסוסים ואזלת יד, נצליח להגביר השפעת יהדות התורה במדינתנו ולשוות על דמותה הראויה. He says, if we don't miss this opportunity, we have before us the ability to reconvene a Sanhedrin, to restore Semicha, to give back to the state of Israel the Jewish flavor that it is so missing. And with this, he ends his book. And like I told you, in the year 1962, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon dies, he passes away, and this idea seems to pass away with him. There were 2 more attempts to reconvene a Sanhedrin, I believe one in 2002, one in 2004. They went to Tveria and they reconvened a Sanhedrin. Rabbi Steinsaltz, alav shalom, who just passed away, he was the head of that newly reconvened Sanhedrin. I don't ever say this on camera, but I figure we're talking about it, we might as well. Harav Peretz, my rabbi, was one of the 70 rabbis who were appointed to be a member of the Sanhedrin, the newly reconvened Sanhedrin, that was at the time done in the early 2000s. Those dreams never came to fruition. We're still waiting. And I think that we're continuing to play this game of let's blame the rabbis, let's blame the people. Nobody's ready. Meanwhile, there's only one thing I can tell you. I don't know if we're ready for Sanhedrin or not. What I do know is that there are problems facing the Jewish community today. Now, real problems, real world issues that I'm not sure that any individual, independent, chacham, organization, great leader will be able to do on their own. There are certain issues, certain reassessments of Judaism that need to happen. They need conversations that need to take place. Authoritative decisions need to be made. But there's no one to make them. And there's no one to turn to make them. And there's no one to talk about Chachamim. There's a reality here that we need to contend with. There are things that we need to deal with that maybe we're not equipped to deal with. And the answer for that should be a Sanhedrin. I'm aware of Sarla, who I don't think is here right now, but last week said, and there's also dangers of a Sanhedrin. There's dangers of putting authority all in one place. There's danger. Well, that's why a Sanhedrin works the way a Sanhedrin works. And we're not asking for a king, and we're not asking for a monarch. We're asking for a group of a variety of Talmidei Chachamim to get together, to have a discussion, to figure out a way to make all of the problems of Judaism not go away, but to find intelligent, innovative, clever solutions for them that will bring us about to the next era of humanity, which should be the days of Mashiach. May we merit to live and see that happen very soon in our day. For right now, all I can do is pray. Hashiva shoftenu kevarishona, v'yoatzenu kevatechila. What we say in our Amidah prayer, Hashem, restore our judges to what they used to be. First, I think in order to restore our judges, Hashem has to restore to our judges the wisdom that they used to have. He has to restore to our leadership the foresight, the ability to see the world in a unique way. And those Chachamim, those leaders of the Jewish people should lead us forward in the future. For right now, we'll do what we can together. And B'ezrat Hashem, I hope to live and see that day come to us very, very soon. Thank you so much for learning with me this week. God willing, I will see you next week for our shiur on the next part of this topic. And B'ezrat Hashem will finish all of this part of the introduction before Pesach comes. I have it down exactly to the week before Pesach. B'ezrat Hashem.